The first time Sadie Langston saw Jeremiah Townsend, he was standing at the bar of the Silver Spur Saloon in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, and he looked like a man who had long since made peace with never being happy again. Dusty Creek was not a large town. It sat pressed against the red earth of West Texas like a thumb pushing down on a wound, its main street a strip of weathered wood and sun-bleached signs, its population somewhere between 400 and the next stage robbery. The railroad had not yet come close enough to matter, and the cattle drive still pushed through every spring and fall, leaving behind mud and coin and the occasional broken bottle. It was the kind of town where everyone knew what you had for supper and who you had argued with about it, and so it was no surprise that within 3 days of Jeremiah Townsend's arrival in late September, everyone had formed an opinion about him. The opinion was largely the same across all corners of the town. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red limestone that lined the creek beds outside of town. He wore a gray duster that had seen better years and a dark hat pulled low, and he carried a rifle and a Colt revolver the way most men carry grief, which was to say quietly, and with the kind of ease that meant he had long since stopped being aware of the weight. He had taken a room above the saloon, paid 3 weeks in advance without being asked, and had not in 3 days smiled at a single person or said a single unnecessary word. He was 28 years old, and he looked like he had already lived 2 full lives and buried both of them. Sadie Langston, on the other hand, was very much alive. She was 24, and she had come to Dusty Creek 18 months prior to open the town's first proper school. She had arrived from Austin with 2 trunks of books, a crate of chalk, a hand-painted sign that read Dusty Creek School of Learning, and a large, shaggy, amber-colored dog of indeterminate breed named Biscuit, who was the approximate size and enthusiasm of a runaway wagon. Biscuit had opinions. He had opinions about the direction of the wind, about strangers, about the correct way to greet a horse, about biscuits themselves, and most particularly about laps. If Biscuit determined that a lap was available, he would occupy it, full 40 or so pounds of him, without consultation or ceremony, and would regard any protest with the calm, unflappable certainty of a creature who knew he was doing the other party a great favor. Sadie adored him. The town, largely, had come around to adoring him too, though more slowly and with considerably more shouting in the early days. He had knocked over Reverend Prout twice, stolen a ham from the general store, and once splashed directly through a mud puddle onto the mayor's Sunday coat. But there was a quality to Biscuit, some irreducible, tail-wagging goodness that made anger toward him feel slightly immoral, and so the town had mostly accepted him as part of its landscape, the way it accepted the red dust and the summer heat. Sadie had heard about Jeremiah Townsend, the way she heard about most things in Dusty Creek, which was from Vera Hutchins, who ran the boarding house next to the school, and who treated the gathering and distribution of local information as a sacred civic duty. "Rode in 3 days past," Vera had told her, appearing at the schoolhouse door after the children had gone home for the afternoon, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, and the particular bright-eyed expression she wore when delivering something genuinely interesting. "Paid up at the saloon, asked Harold about work, and has not spoken more than 4 words together since. Took supper at my place last evening, sat at the corner table, ate everything on the plate without looking up once. Did not say thank you. Perhaps he was tired," Sadie had said, straightening the rows of readers on the shelf. "Tired does not explain the look in his eyes," Vera had said, with the authority of a woman who had housed a great many traveling men and developed strong opinions about their various psychological conditions. "That man has lost something." Sadie had not thought much more about it, because she had 41 children to educate, a leaking roof corner to petition the town council about, and a half-finished letter to her sister in Austin to complete. She had troubles of her own, Not dramatic ones, but persistent ones, the kind that settle into a life like dust into floorboards. Her school funding from the county was inconsistent. Her landlord, a man named Cutter who owned the building her schoolhouse occupied, had recently hinted that he might sell the building to the new dry goods merchant looking to expand. And she was 24 and unmarried in a town that looked at an unmarried schoolteacher the way it looked at a fence post without a rail, useful enough on its own, but clearly waiting for something to attach itself to. She had not gone looking for Jeremiah Townsend. The West Texas autumn had a way of making distances shorter. It was a Thursday morning, 6 days after his arrival, when Sadie was crossing Main Street with Biscuit at her side, heading to the general store for the chalk and paper supplies that the school perpetually needed more of and that the county perpetually underfunded. Biscuit was on a rope lead, which was a theoretical constraint rather than a practical one, as he moved largely where he chose, and the rope served primarily to give Sadie the impression of control. Jeremiah was sitting on the bench outside the Silver Spur, which he had apparently adopted as his morning position, a cup of coffee in one hand and his eyes on the middle distance, watching nothing in particular with the intensity of a man who had developed watching nothing into a discipline. Biscuit saw him. Biscuit made his assessment in the way that dogs make assessments, which is to say instantly and without conscious reasoning, and that assessment was clearly and decisively, "That man needs me." He lunged. Sadie was pulled forward half a step before the rope went slack, because Biscuit had already covered the ground between them with the joyful, bounding efficiency of a creature who understood that proximity was everything, and that hesitation was for cats. He did not bark. He did not jump up against Jeremiah's chest, which was unusual for Biscuit in a greeting situation. Instead, he put his front paws up onto the bench beside Jeremiah, looked directly into the man's face from a distance of perhaps 4 inches, and then, in a single fluid motion that involved a great deal of confident wiggling, climbed directly into Jeremiah Townsend's lap. He settled there with a sigh, laid his head against Jeremiah's chest, and closed his eyes. Jeremiah Townsend did not move. His coffee cup remained suspended halfway between the bench arm and his mouth. His eyes had dropped to the dog in his lap with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but something in the middle, something that had no clean word but that looked, in the morning light, like a man who had been handed something he had forgotten he was missing. Sadie arrived at a slightly undignified pace, one hand holding her hat on against the morning wind. "I am so sorry," she said, reaching for the rope lead. "He does this. I cannot always prevent him. He is very certain that he knows what people need, and he is sometimes right, which only encourages him. Biscuit, come." Biscuit did not come. Biscuit pressed himself more firmly against Jeremiah's chest and gave a sound that was half sigh and half snore. Jeremiah looked at the dog. Then he looked up at Sadie. She was standing in the morning sun, one hand still on her hat, dark hair coming loose at the temple from the braid she'd pinned up that morning, wearing a dusty blue dress with ink on the cuff from yesterday's lesson. And she was looking at him with an expression that was genuinely apologetic, but also, underneath the apology, just barely amused, because she had lived with Biscuit long enough to know that watching him ambush people was almost always funny from the outside. Jeremiah looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the dog in his lap. He set his coffee cup down slowly on the bench beside him. He did not remove the dog. He did not say anything. But something moved across his face, something very small and very quick. Not a smile exactly, not yet, but the thing that lives just before a smile, the muscle memory of it, the ghost of it, surfacing briefly before it submerged again. "He is not bothering me," Jeremiah said. His voice was lower than Sadie had expected and measured, the voice of a man who chose words the way a careful gambler chose cards. "He is absolutely bothering you," Sadie said. "He has occupied your lap without invitation and he weighs 40 pounds. 42, Jeremiah said after a moment, as if he had somehow already calculated this. "He is fine where he is." Sadie blinked. She had not expected that. She had expected the polite extraction, the mild irritation, the usual human response to having a large dog suddenly installed in one's lap without permission. She shifted her grip on the rope lead and looked at the dog, who was deeply and contentedly settled, and then at the man, who was still looking at Biscuit with that careful, unreadable expression that was not quite closed but was not yet open. "I am Sadie Langston," she said. "I teach at the school on Cedar Street." He looked up at her again. "Jeremiah Townsend." "I know," she said. "Small town." Something shifted very slightly in his expression, not quite wry but adjacent to it. "I am aware of that. Are you looking for work?" Asked because it seemed like the practical thing to ask and because she had learned in 24 years that practical questions were often the most honest ones. "Vera Hutchins mentioned you asked Harold at the saloon." "Harold has no work that fits what I do," Jeremiah said. "And what is it that you do?" He considered the question for a moment that was just long enough to be interesting. "I find things," he said, "and I solve problems." That is a broad description. It is a broad skill set. Biscuit made a contented sound in his lap, and Jeremiah's hand dropped, almost involuntarily, to rest on the dog's back. It was not a petting motion exactly, more the instinctive settling of a hand that had found something warm and alive and unexpectedly present. But it was something. Sadie watched it happen and felt something quiet and particular shift in her chest, some small recalibration she could not entirely account for. "Well," she said, because she needed to go to the general store and she needed to stop standing in the middle of Main Street having a conversation with a man she had just met over the body of her settled dog. "The town generally manages to produce problems of one kind or another. I am sure someone will find a use for your skill set, Mr. Townsend." "Jeremiah," he said. She paused. "Pardon? You can call me Jeremiah." He said it without particular warmth but without coldness either, in the tone of a man making a factual correction. "Jeremiah," she said. Then, because it seemed fair, "Sadie." She pulled gently on the rope lead, and this time Biscuit, apparently satisfied that he had accomplished what he came to accomplish, rose from the lap with the dignified unhurry of a creature who leaves when he chooses to leave and not a moment before. He landed on the ground, shook himself, and fell into step beside Sadie. She walked toward the general store without looking back. She was perhaps 20 feet down the boardwalk when she heard the sound. It was brief. It was quiet. It was, unmistakably, a low sound that was not quite a laugh but was made from the same material, exhaled rather than voiced, surprised out of a man rather than offered by him. She did not turn around, but she was smiling before she reached the general store door. The job came to Jeremiah Townsend not from Harold at the saloon, but from Mayor Amos Greer, who was a round, practical man with a gift for recognizing useful people and the unsentimental willingness to employ them. What had brought Jeremiah to Dusty Creek in the first place was a combination of factors that he had not discussed with anyone: the end of a contract up in Colorado, a debt paid in a town he no longer wanted to be in, and the kind of exhaustion that comes not from overwork but from too many years of work that leaves marks on the inside. He was, by trade and by necessity, a man who had worked as a range detective, a scout, and on 2 occasions as a deputy in towns that needed temporary authority. He had a reputation that preceded him in certain circles, not as a violent man, though he was capable of violence when it was warranted, but as a thorough one. He found missing cattle and missing people and missing truths with the same patient, methodical attention to the evidence available, and he had rarely been wrong enough to matter. Mayor Greer came to him on a Friday morning, 10 days after Jeremiah's arrival, and sat down uninvited across the table, where Jeremiah was eating breakfast at Vera Hutchins's boarding house, and laid out the situation plainly. There had been cattle disappearing from the 3 ranches north of Dusty Creek for the past 4 months. Not a great number at a time, but consistently, and in a pattern that suggested something organized rather than opportunistic. The county sheriff was based 60 miles east in Clearwater and had visited twice without producing any useful result. The ranchers, 3 men named Holt, Briggs, and Calhoun, were losing patience and money in equal measure, and 2 of them had begun to make the kind of noise that suggested they might resolve the problem themselves in ways that would likely create additional problems. "I have heard your name," Mayor Greer said, folding his hands on the table. "From Abilene, from 2 ranchers who found their stock again in 1880. They spoke well of you." Jeremiah had eaten a bite of eggs before responding. "My rate is $2 a day plus expenses." "Done," Greer said. "And there's a $50 bonus from the ranchers if you find who is behind this and bring evidence sufficient for a judge." Jeremiah had looked at him steadily. "I do not manufacture evidence." "I am not asking you to," Greer said, with a dignity that suggested he was slightly offended by the implication. "I am asking you to find what is actually there." It was a fair commission, and it gave him a reason to stay, which he had been looking for without fully admitting it to himself. He began his work quietly, as he always did, riding the range north of town to read the land, which was something he did literally and figuratively, looking at tracks and grass patterns and fence lines and waterways. He interviewed the ranchers with the patience of a man who understood that people always told you more than they intended to if you asked the right questions in the right order. He spent 2 evenings at the saloon listening to the conversations around him without participating in them, because the Silver Spur was the place where information loosened itself from people, the way trail dust loosened itself from clothes, gradually and completely if you gave it enough time. He did not make friends. He did not seek company. He ate his meals, rode his circuit, made his notes in the small leather-bound journal he kept in his breast pocket, and returned to his room above the saloon each night to sit at the window and look at the darkness until he was tired enough to sleep. But he saw Sadie Langston, not deliberately, in the beginning. She was simply part of Dusty Creek in a way that made her presence natural and frequent. She crossed Main Street every morning with Biscuit beside her, heading to the schoolhouse. She appeared at the general store on Thursdays with her list of supplies. She was at the Sunday service at the small Baptist church on Elm Street, sitting 4 rows from the front on the left side. She was at the town council meeting the 2nd Tuesday of every month, because she attended them to petition for the school's consistent funding, and because she had learned. She told Vera Hutchins loudly on one occasion when Jeremiah happened to be sitting close enough to hear, that nothing in this world gets done unless the people who need it done show up and say so out loud. He noticed the way she talked to the children in the street, the way she crouched down to their level without thinking about it, making herself small so they did not have to make themselves large. He noticed the way she argued at the town council, which was not the way that most people argued, with heat and volume, but with a methodical, specific patience that produced the evidence of her case the way a good lawyer produced evidence, one irrefutable piece at a time, until the opposing position had no ground left to stand on. He noticed that she laughed easily but not emptily. That her laugh was a real thing, a full sound that she did not moderate or contain, that it happened when something struck her as genuinely funny and not a moment before. He did not approach her. He did not know how to approach people toward whom he felt something. It had been a long time since he had felt something, and the mechanism for it had rusted over considerably in the intervening years. It was Biscuit who did the approaching, again and without negotiation. The second time was a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the bench incident, when Jeremiah was coming out of the church because Vera Hutchins had looked at him with enough pointed meaning over the breakfast table that he had felt obligated to attend, though he had sat in the very last pew and had left directly after the final hymn. Sadie was in the churchyard talking to Reverend Prout, Biscuit sitting more or less politely at her feet, and when Jeremiah walked past, Biscuit rose, shook himself, and walked directly over to fall into step beside Jeremiah as if this had been prearranged. Jeremiah looked down at him. Biscuit looked up with an expression of absolute confidence. Sadie, across the churchyard, watched this happen and pressed her lips together against a smile. She said a quick goodbye to Reverend Prout and came across the grass. "He has decided you are his," she said. "I did not agree to that," Jeremiah said. "Biscuit does not require agreement," she said. "He requires only presence." Jeremiah looked at her. She was wearing her Sunday dress, pale yellow with a small blue collar, her hair done up more carefully than the weekday braid, and she was standing in the autumn sunlight looking at him with those dark eyes that were somehow both direct and warm at the same time, which was a combination he found deeply difficult to look away from. "How long have you had him?" he asked, about the dog, because it was a safer question than the ones forming themselves behind it. "I found him 3 days before I left Austin," she said. "He was sitting in the road outside my boarding house, enormously pleased with himself and with nowhere particular to be. I brought him inside for the night and he has never quite left." She looked down at Biscuit, who was now sitting between them like a small, furry moderator of the conversation. "I think he was waiting for me specifically." "Dogs know things," Jeremiah said, and then stopped as if surprised by the sentiment. Sadie looked at him with an expression that was careful and kind. "My father used to say that. He said dogs were a better judge of character than most people." He was right. He was, mostly. She paused, and there was something in that pause, a shadow of something that came and went quickly. "He passed 4 years ago. He was a schoolteacher, too, in Austin. I suppose I came by the profession honestly." "I am sorry," Jeremiah said, with a simplicity and directness that made the words land differently than they usually did, without the cushioning of excess that usually made condolence feel performative. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she had learned to move through grief without being stopped by it, "What about your people? Do you have family somewhere?" He was quiet for a moment. Not an evasive quiet, but a thinking one. "A sister," he said, "in Missouri. We write when we remember to. And before Dusty Creek, Colorado," he said. "Before that, Kansas. Before that, New Mexico for a time. You move a great deal." "Work moves," he said. She nodded slowly. "Is that the whole reason?" He looked at her. The question was direct without being unkind. He had noticed that about her, the ability to ask a direct question and make it feel like an offered hand rather than a pointed finger. "No," he said after a moment. "Not the whole reason." She did not push. She simply accepted the answer and gave him the silence to fill or not fill as he chose. He chose not to fill it, but he felt, for the first time in a long time, that the silence was not entirely his own. Biscuit yawned enormously between them, and both of them looked down at him, and both of them in the same moment made the same small sound that was not quite a laugh. It was not a smile yet, but it was something. It was the beginning of something. The cattle investigation proceeded in the quiet, unhurried way that Jeremiah's investigations always proceeded. By the end of his second week of work, he had a strong theory and was building the evidence to support it. The pattern of the disappearances pointed toward a stretch of land along the creek bed that ran between the Holt and Briggs properties, specifically a cut in the canyon wall to the northwest that led through to a flat and largely unseen valley where, he suspected, stolen cattle were being held and driven at intervals to a buyer somewhere north, likely in the direction of the New Mexico border. The person he suspected of organizing it was a man named Del Sutter, who ran a small horse trading operation outside of town, and who had the look of a man who skimmed from every surface available to him. Sutter was careful, and careful men required patience, and Jeremiah was patient by nature and by practice. In the meantime, Dusty Creek continued around him, and Sadie Langston continued to be a part of it. It was Vera Hutchins, eventually and inevitably, who provided the catalyst for the next thing. Vera had noticed, in the way that Vera noticed everything, that Jeremiah had begun to take his morning coffee at a bench outside the saloon roughly around the time that Sadie and Biscuit passed on their way to the school. She had also noticed, with the precision of a born observer, that on 3 occasions in the past week, this coincidence had resulted in a conversation that lasted somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes, and that Jeremiah Townsend, who did not speak to people, spoke to Sadie Langston. She said nothing about this directly to either of them, because she was too clever to be direct about it. Instead, she organized a town supper. Vera organized a town supper every fall, a tradition she had maintained for 6 years, held in the open yard behind the boarding house, with long tables brought out from the church hall and every household contributing something to eat. It was the kind of event that was easy to decline in theory and nearly impossible to decline in practice, because Vera issued her invitations personally, and with the particular warm tenacity of a woman who understood that most people, given the proper conditions, would rather be with others than alone, even if they had forgotten this fact about themselves. She appeared at Jeremiah's door on a Wednesday evening with a plate of cornbread she had absolutely not baked as a pretext and said, "The town supper is Saturday. You will come." Jeremiah had looked at the cornbread and then at Vera. He had known the cornbread was a pretext. He had accepted it anyway, because he was not, in the end, immune to warm cornbread. "I will consider it," he said. "You will come," Vera said pleasantly, and went back downstairs. He went. The supper was held on a clear Saturday evening in late October, when the Texas sky turned the particular shade of deep blue that made the first stars visible before the sun had fully set. The yard behind the boarding house was strung with lanterns, borrowed and collected from half the houses in town, and the tables were heavy with food, roasted meats and corn and beans and 3 different kinds of pie, and the people of Dusty Creek filled the space with the kind of easy, familiar noise that small communities make when they gather, the intersecting stories and the laughter across the table, and the children running in the gaps between the adults. Jeremiah stood at the edge of it for a moment when he arrived, feeling the familiar sensation of being outside a thing he could see clearly but could not quite find the door into. He had felt this at every gathering for years. He had stopped going to most of them. Then Biscuit found him. Biscuit emerged from under one of the tables with something that appeared to be a corn cake in his mouth, and the expression of a creature who has committed a minor crime and intends to do so again. He stopped when he saw Jeremiah, dropped the corn cake without guilt, and came to sit directly at Jeremiah's feet, looking up at him with the calm certainty that this was where he was supposed to be. Jeremiah looked down at the dog. "You have no shame at all," he said quietly. Biscuit's tail swept the ground. "Absolutely does not," Sadie said, appearing from the direction of the tables with a plate in each hand and a look of resigned amusement. "He stole that from the Hendersons' contribution. Mrs. Henderson saw but decided to let it go, which is the wisest approach she could have taken. She held out one of the plates. I brought you one in case you were considering standing at the edge all evening without eating anything." Jeremiah looked at the plate, then at her. "You were expecting to find me at the edge." "I had a reasonable suspicion," she said, without apology and with enough warmth that it did not feel like criticism. He took the plate. They ate standing together at the edge of the yard at first, and then, gradually, without any announced decision, they drifted toward one of the tables and sat down, and the conversation that had been happening in pieces over the past weeks began to happen in a longer, more continuous form. He talked more than he had talked in months. She drew it out of him not by asking too much but by saying enough of her own that he felt the reciprocity of it, that talking to Sadie Langston was not an extraction but an exchange. She told him about Austin, about her mother who still lived there and wrote letters that were 2 parts advice and 1 part news. About the way she had felt when she had seen the posting for a teacher in Dusty Creek, a specific and electric certainty that this was what she was supposed to do and where she was supposed to do it. About the children in her school, 41 of them ranging from age 6 to 14, and the particular joy and particular exhaustion of being responsible for that many small minds. He told her, carefully and in pieces, about Colorado. About the years of work that had taken him across more of the West than he had ever intended to see. He did not tell her the thing that he carried, not yet, not all of it, but he told her something around the edges of it, the way a man might describe the shape of a room without turning on the light. "You left something behind," she said, not as a question. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone," he said. "She waited." "My wife," he said. "She died 3 years ago in Colorado, fever." The word landed in the space between them quietly, the way serious things land when they are said plainly. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was good." "I am sorry," Sadie said, and it was the same simplicity she had received from him, returned without decoration. "We were married 2 years," he said. "I was not home enough. I worked too much. By the time I understood that, I had very little time left to correct it." He had never said that out loud to anyone. He was not certain why he said it now, to a woman he had known less than a month, in a lantern-lit yard in West Texas with her dog asleep across both their feet. Sadie did not offer him absolution or comfort in the easy, cushioned sense. She said, "You know that grief and guilt are two different things, though they often travel together." He looked at her. "You did not cause the fever," she said. "You may have cause to wish you had spent your time differently, but those are not the same wound." He had no answer for that. It was both the most useful and the most difficult thing anyone had said to him in 3 years. Biscuit made a snoring sound across their feet, and Jeremiah Townsend, in the lantern light of Vera Hutchins's yard in the last week of October 1882, smiled. It was a small thing, a real thing, the first real one in longer than he could precisely account for. It came because of Biscuit, asleep and snoring and utterly unbothered by the weight of human sorrow, and because of the woman beside him who had said the true thing without flinching, and because something in the combination of those two facts was, unexpectedly and without his permission, enough to make him feel, for one moment, like a man who was still capable of being present in the world. Sadie saw it. She did not comment on it. But she saw it, and it sat in her chest the rest of the evening like a coal in winter, warm and steady and impossible to ignore. November came in on a cold wind that swept down from the Panhandle and filled Dusty Creek with the smell of wood smoke and dried grass. The ranchers grew more impatient, and Mayor Greer sent word to Jeremiah asking for a progress report. Jeremiah replied with his usual brevity and specificity, writing that he expected to have actionable evidence within the week, and that moving prematurely would lose the case entirely. He had by then confirmed, through 2 nights of careful and cold observation from the canyon ridge above the creek, that Del Sutter was indeed moving stolen cattle through the cut in the canyon wall, using 2 hired men, neither of whom appeared to be from Dusty Creek, to handle the movement. The buyer, he had also established through a set of inquiries in towns along the likely route, was a stockyard operator across the border who asked few questions and paid competitive prices. What he needed was to catch Sutter in the act and document it in a way that would hold up before a judge. He had done this before. He knew how to do it. It required patience and the ability to be very still and very cold for a long time, which he had developed into something approaching a skill. He had not, however, anticipated that on the night he planned his final observation, the night he intended to be in position at the canyon cut to document the next cattle movement, Biscuit would follow him. He had left town quietly just past 10 in the evening, riding north on his gray horse in the cold dark. He was perhaps a mile out when he heard the sound behind him, the soft, rapid pad of paws on the dry grass. He stopped and turned, and there was Biscuit trotting along in the moonlight with the unstoppable confidence of a dog who had decided this outing was also his outing. Jeremiah looked at him for a long moment. "You cannot come," he said. Biscuit sat down. "It is not safe." Biscuit waited. "If you make a sound at the wrong moment, you will ruin 3 weeks of work." Biscuit appeared entirely unconcerned about this. Jeremiah could not take him back to town without losing the window he needed. He could not tie him somewhere along the trail because an untied dog in the dark would eventually make noise regardless. He calculated his options and concluded that the best available one was to take Biscuit with him and pray that the dog understood, at some instinctive level, the requirement for silence. He had worked with tracking dogs before. Biscuit was not a tracking dog. Biscuit was a dog who had installed himself in laps without permission and stolen food from church suppers. These were not the same skill set, but Biscuit, to his credit and Jeremiah's genuine surprise, was absolutely silent. He moved through the dark beside the horse with a focused, low-bodied quiet that suggested he understood, in whatever way dogs understand things, that this night was different. He did not bark. He did not rustle. He was a shadow beside Jeremiah's shadow, and when they reached the ridge above the canyon cut and Jeremiah dismounted and tied the horse and settled in the cold dark to watch, Biscuit settled beside him and was still. They were there for 2 hours. The cold was serious but not dangerous, and Jeremiah's coat was thick. Biscuit pressed against his leg, providing warmth in the uncomplicated, generous way that dogs provide warmth, simply by being there. Sutter's men came at midnight, moving 12 head of Holt cattle through the cut with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this a specific number of times and expected to do it several more. Jeremiah documented what he needed from the ridge, confirming faces and numbers and the direction of the movement, and when Sutter himself appeared at the tail of the small procession, directing operations from horseback, Jeremiah noted his distinctive spotted gray horse and the red bandana he wore even in the dark, details that would matter in front of a judge. He did not confront them. It was not time for that, and one man on a ridge was not the appropriate force anyway. What he had was enough, and he rode back to town in the cold dark with Biscuit trotting beside the horse, already composing the written account he would deliver to Mayor Greer in the morning. The morning came, and with it the delivery of his report, and Greer's satisfied nod, and the sending of a telegram to the county sheriff in Clearwater, with sufficient specific evidence that the sheriff could no longer reasonably avoid the 90-mile round trip. The sheriff arrived 4 days later, and with the documentation Jeremiah had prepared, and 2 of Jeremiah's provided witnesses, the legal process that would eventually result in Del Sutter's arrest and trial was set in motion. It would not be a fast process. Justice in 1882 West Texas was not a swift mechanism, but it was moving, which was more than it had been doing. The ranchers paid the bonus. Mayor Greer shook Jeremiah's hand with genuine warmth, and Jeremiah, sitting in the morning quiet of his room above the saloon, looked at the money in his hand and thought, for the first time in years, about what staying in a place might look like. He went to find Sadie. She was not at the school, which had let out early due to some complicated crisis involving a skunk that had found its way into the woodshed adjacent to the school building. He found her at the general store, discussing the skunk situation with Harold Brewer with the particular resigned competence of a woman who had handled enough unexpected crises that she had developed a general method for them. "We simply must wait," she was saying as Jeremiah came through the door. "Attempting to drive it out will make things considerably worse. By morning it will move on of its own accord, and we can air the woodshed, and no permanent harm will be done." "Morning means no heat tomorrow morning," Harold said. "Temperature is dropping tonight." "The children will bring extra coats," Sadie said firmly. "We have managed with less." She looked up and saw Jeremiah at the door, and her expression shifted into something warm and curious. "You look like a man with news." "The sheriff has what he needs," Jeremiah said. "Sutter will be arrested before the week is out." Her face opened into a genuine smile, the full kind, the kind she did not moderate. "Jeremiah, that is wonderful." She crossed toward him, and there was a naturalness to the movement, an ease in the closing of distance between them that had been building for weeks. "The ranchers must be relieved." "They are," he said. "And you?" she asked. "Are you relieved?" He thought about the question. "I am satisfied," he said. "It is a slightly different thing." "Yes," she said. "I know what you mean." She bought her supplies. He carried the heavier packages for her without being asked, in the simple way that it was logical to do so, and they walked together toward the school in the cold November air, and Biscuit appeared from somewhere, presumably having been asleep in a patch of sun around the corner, and fell into step between them. They walked in a comfortable quiet for half a block. Then Sadie said, without turning her head, "What happens next for you?" He thought about it for a full half block before answering. "I had been considering that. And "I find that I am in less of a hurry to move on than I expected to be," he said. She looked at him then, sideways and steady, with those dark eyes that always looked at things straight on. "Dusty Creek is not a town that makes much noise about its virtues," she said carefully. "It has them, but it keeps them quiet." "I have noticed the virtues," he said, and he was not talking about the town. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked forward again, and her cheeks had color in them that was not entirely from the cold. "The school building is in danger of being sold," she said, after a moment, shifting to practical ground the way she did when she needed to think about something while talking about something else. "The owner, Mr. Cutter, has had an offer from a merchant. I have been petitioning the council to purchase it from him on behalf of the town, but the council is slow and Cutter may not wait." "How much is Cutter asking?" She told him the figure. He said nothing, but he was calculating, and she could see that he was calculating, and she looked at him with a slight frown. "I am not looking for a benefactor," she said. "I am telling you about a problem, not asking you to solve it." "I know," he said. "But I solve problems. I find it difficult to turn the impulse off." She stopped walking and turned to face him. The school building was visible at the end of the block. Biscuit sat between them and yawned. "Jeremiah," she said, with a directness that she had been practicing for approximately 2 weeks, "what is it that you are hoping for, in Dusty Creek, in staying?" He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who spoke easily about the interior things. He had spent 3 years building walls around the interior things and living in the constructed quiet they provided. But Sadie Langston had a way of standing in front of walls and looking at them with such calm patience that they lost their structural integrity. "I think you know," he said. "I would like to hear you say it." He was quiet. Then, "I am hoping that you might be willing to let me know you better. That I might be able to give you reason to find that worthwhile." She looked at him for a long moment that was very still. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have already given me a good deal of reason to find it worthwhile." Something happened in his face. The same thing that had happened in the lantern light at the supper, but deeper this time, less surprised. A settling, like a horse finding level ground. "Then I would like to court you," he said, with the simple formality that fit both the time and the man, "if you are willing." She was smiling now, fully and without any attempt to contain it. "I am willing, Jeremiah." Biscuit sneezed loudly and looked at both of them with satisfaction. Courting in Dusty Creek in 1882 was a matter of some public interest, and so Jeremiah and Sadie's courtship was conducted with the awareness that approximately 400 people were watching it with varying degrees of subtlety. Vera Hutchins watched with outright pride. Reverend Prout watched with approval. Harold at the saloon watched with the slightly surprised goodwill of a man who had not expected the silent stranger to become a person of interest in the town's social fabric, but was glad to see it. The courtship itself was, in Sadie's private opinion, the best kind. Not the theatrical kind, not the kind made of grand gestures and performances, but the kind made of accumulated days and honest conversation and the growing, specific knowledge of another person. He came to the school on Thursday afternoons, after the children had left, and helped her organize the supplies and fix the small things that needed fixing. He was practical and competent with his hands, and watching him repair the broken hinge on the door or reinforce the shelf bracket with the same careful attention he brought to everything was, she found, a specific pleasure. She brought him supper from time to time at the saloon, arriving with a covered plate and sitting across from him at the corner table he had made his own, and they talked, and the talking got easier and deeper and more various with every iteration of it. He told her more about Clara, not every evening but when it came naturally, and she listened with the kind of listening that does not try to fix or minimize. She understood that the grief was not a rival to what was growing between them. It was a part of him, a room in the house of who he was, and she did not want to close it off. She only wanted him to know that the rest of the house was also habitable. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, the son of a farming family, the eldest of four, the one who had felt earliest the restlessness that would carry him west. He had wanted to see the country, and he had seen it, but somewhere in the seeing he had lost the thread back to himself, and he was only now, at 28, in this small red dust town in West Texas, finding it again. She told him about the loneliness of the first year in Dusty Creek, about how she had been determined, and how determination was not the same thing as ease, about how she had built the school with the council's grudging support and the community's cautious interest, and how the first morning she had walked in and found 41 children sitting in the rows of desks she had arranged herself. She had stood at the front of the room and thought, "This is exactly right." "That is a rare thing," he said, "to know that a thing is exactly right." "Yes," she agreed. "It is very rare." She was looking at him when she said it. In December, Jeremiah took a position as deputy to the Dusty Creek constable, a man named Hicks who was competent enough but aging and increasingly glad of assistance. The position paid a modest wage and was supplemented by occasional private commissions of the kind that had always constituted his work. It meant that he had a reason to be in Dusty Creek that extended beyond Sadie, which was important to him. He did not want to be a man who stayed somewhere only for a woman. He wanted to be a man who had built something of his own in a place, so that what he offered her was not his need but his presence. She understood this about him without being told, which was the kind of understanding that comes from paying careful attention to a person, and she respected it without comment. The school building crisis came to a resolution in January, and not through Jeremiah's money, though he had quietly offered it and she had quietly declined it, but through Sadie's relentless council petitioning and the eventual rallying of 3 of the town's more prosperous citizens, who had children in the school and who, once Sadie presented her case with sufficient clarity, came to the conclusion that a permanent school building was worth a share of the purchase price. Cut or sold to the town. Sadie stayed. The children stayed. The building stayed. Jeremiah watched this unfold with a pride that was deep and quiet and entirely disproportionate to his involvement in it. "You did that," he said, the evening after the purchase was confirmed, sitting on the bench outside the saloon where she had come to find him. "The council did that," she said, "with some persuasion." "You did that," he said again, and the certainty in his voice made her look at him with something that was halfway between surprised and deeply moved. Biscuit was in his lap. This had become the default condition of their outdoor conversations, Biscuit having determined that Jeremiah's lap was the correct place to be when all 3 of them were in the same location. Jeremiah had stopped pretending to object to this weeks ago. He had simply started sitting down when Biscuit was present because it was going to happen anyway and resistance was unkind. He had his hand on the dog's back, steady and warm, and he was looking at Sadie in the January cold with an expression that was so open and so direct that she felt her breath catch. "Sadie," he said. "Yes," she said. Not as an answer to a question he had not yet asked, but as the simple affirmation that she was here and she was listening, and whatever came next she was ready for it. "I am not a man who says things easily," he said. "I think you know that." "I know that," she said. "So I want it to mean something when I say this," he said. "I love you." I did not expect to love anyone again. I did not believe it was something I still had in me. And I understand that I am not a simple man to know and that I have a great deal of history that I cannot change. But I love you and I would like if you are willing to build something with you, something real, something that stays. She was very still for a moment, not hesitating, only taking the full weight of what he had said and letting it settle into her as it deserved to settle. Then she reached out and put her hand over his, the one resting on Biscuit's back, and the warmth of it went through him like the first real warm day after a long winter. "Jeremiah Townsend," she said quietly, "I have been falling in love with you since the morning Biscuit climbed into your lap and you did not push him off." "That was the first day," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment, And then he did something that surprised her, which was that he lifted her hand from his and brought it to his lips in the simple, deliberate gesture of a man who had decided that the time for restraint was over. Biscuit sneezed on both of them. It could not be said that this ruined the moment. What it did was make them both laugh, fully and at the same time in the cold January evening, which was perhaps better than what had been about to happen, because laughter was also a kind of love, and they had found plenty of it between them. He proposed to her properly in February, on a Sunday after church, with the ring that had been his grandmother's, which he had carried with him across 5 states for reasons he had not been fully able to articulate until now. He went down on one knee on the frozen ground of the churchyard and said her name, and she said yes before he had finished the question. And then she said, "I told you to finish the question." And he laughed, the real kind, and said the rest of it anyway. Vera Hutchins, who had happened to be standing close enough to witness this from a strategically chosen position, cried openly and with no embarrassment whatsoever. The wedding was in April, when the Texas bluebonnets were coming up along the creek banks, and the air had that particular spring quality of being washed clean. It was not a large ceremony. Reverend Prout presided with his best propriety. The church was full, because the whole town came, because Dusty Creek understood by now that this marriage was the kind of thing you showed up for. Sadie wore her mother's dress, the cream-colored silk one that had arrived in a trunk from Austin along with her mother herself, who had made the journey from Austin by stage, and who had spent the 3 days before the wedding alternating between crying with happiness and taking Jeremiah's measure with the thoroughness of a woman who had one daughter and intended to see her well situated. Jeremiah had submitted to this scrutiny with a patience and a directness that had, by the 3rd day, won Sadie Langston's complete approval. She told Sadie privately the morning of the wedding, "He is a good man. He is not an easy man, but the good ones rarely are." Sadie had agreed and then gone to put on the dress. The moment of the ceremony that she would remember longest was not the vows, though the vows were said well and meant deeply, but the moment just before, when she walked down the narrow aisle of the Dusty Creek Baptist Church and saw Jeremiah standing at the front, waiting. He was in his good dark coat, cleaned and pressed, his hat held in both hands in front of him, and he was watching her come toward him with an expression that was so completely unguarded that it made her step slow slightly, just for a moment, because she needed to take it in. He looked like a man who had been given back something he had believed was gone forever. She walked the rest of the way. They said the words. Reverend Prout pronounced them married. Jeremiah lifted her veil and held her face in both his hands as if it were something extraordinarily precious, which from the look on his face it was, and kissed her in the way that meant this and everything after this. Biscuit, who had somehow made his way into the back of the church and was sitting in the last pew, broke into a series of decisive barks that the whole congregation agreed were entirely appropriate. The life they built in Dusty Creek was good. Not perfect, because nothing is perfect and the West did not offer perfect, but good in the ways that mattered most, which were substance and company, and the knowledge that you were not doing any of it alone. They moved into the small house on Poplar Street that Jeremiah had spent the late winter making habitable. It had been a vacant property that Mayor Greer had helped him purchase at a reasonable rate, and he had worked on it for 2 months, fixing the roof and reinforcing the walls and building a proper kitchen shelf that Sadie could actually reach the top of, because he had noticed that she stood on her toes at the general store to reach the top shelf, and he had decided this was something he could correct. She loved the house. She loved the kitchen, which had a window over the sink that looked out onto a yard where she immediately began planning a garden. She loved the front room where the bookshelves went, built by Jeremiah's careful hands, wide enough for the growing collection of readers and reference books, and the occasional novel that she considered a professional research tool. She loved that it had 2 bedrooms, and when she told him why the 2nd bedroom mattered to her, the warmth in his face was the answer she needed. She was expecting their first child by June. She told him on an evening in June, when the heat had settled in for good, and the yard was full of fireflies, and Biscuit was asleep on the porch with his chin on Jeremiah's boot. She had been holding it for 2 days, rolling the knowledge around inside herself, making sure of it, making sure she was ready to say it. She said it simply. She had always found simple the most reliable approach. Jeremiah went very still. Then he set down the mug he had been holding and turned to look at her with an expression that went through about 7 different things in the space of 3 seconds, and settled, finally, on something so nakedly happy that Sadie felt her eyes fill without her permission. "Are you certain?" he said. "Mrs. Calhoun confirmed it yesterday," she said. "Mrs. Calhoun was the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a midwife, a capable woman who had delivered more of the town's children than anyone else, and who had a practical, reassuring bedside manner. Likely February. Jeremiah reached for her hand and held it with both of his, the way he had held her face in the church, as if it were something precious. "Sadie," he said, and her name in his voice in that moment was worth everything she had ever done to end up in Dusty Creek, on this porch in this life. "I know," she said. "I know." Biscuit stirred, looked up at both of them with his amber eyes and dropped his chin back onto Jeremiah's boot. The fireflies continued. The night was warm and wide and full of possibilities. Summer moved into fall with the easy transition that Sadie had come to love about West Texas, the gradual cooling of the days and the lengthening of the nights, and the smell of hay being cut on the ranches north of town. The school reopened in September with 44 children now, 3 new families having settled near Dusty Creek over the summer. Sadie taught through her pregnancy with the determination of a woman who saw no reason why her condition should interrupt 44 children's education, though she did allow Jeremiah to walk her to school in the mornings, which he did every day without exception, Biscuit alongside them. He worried about her. He was not a man who expressed worry with noise. He expressed it with presence and with the practical removal of problems before she encountered them, the chopped wood stacked by the door before she could haul it herself, the heavy crate from the general store waiting on the porch when she came home, the extra blanket folded at the foot of the bed when the October nights turned cold. She noticed all of these things and she loved him for each of them, and she told him so. "You do not have to take care of everything," she said, one evening in October. "I know," he said. "I want to." "There is a difference," she said, "between wanting to and needing to." "The wanting is fine. I just want you to know I am not fragile." He looked at her with an expression that was very still and very clear. "I know you are not fragile," he said. "I have never thought you were fragile, but I have been given something I did not expect to have again, and it is natural to want to protect it." She reached across the table and put her hand on his arm. "You are allowed to love me without being afraid of losing me," she said quietly. "I intend to stay." Something passed through his face at that, some deep and private thing. "I know," he said, and she could tell that he was working on believing it. And she understood that the work was not evidence of doubt in her, but of the damage that loss does to a person's ability to trust the permanence of good things. She was patient with that. She would always be patient with that. "Stay here," he said. "I am here," she said. "I am here every day. I intend to be here every day for a very long time, Jeremiah." He exhaled slowly. And then he reached across and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen, while the October wind moved outside and Biscuit slept by the stove. Del Sutter's trial was held in Clearwater in November, and Jeremiah rode east to give his testimony. He was gone 4 days, and Sadie managed the school and the house and Biscuit's considerable personality without difficulty. But she noticed the absence the way you notice a sound that has stopped, in the particular quality of the quiet. He came back on a Thursday evening, dusty from the road and tired from 4 days of courthouse air, and she had supper waiting and Biscuit greeted him at the gate with the full force of his enthusiasm. And when Jeremiah came through the door and Sadie came out of the kitchen, and he pulled her carefully into his arms with the particular care he had begun to use now that she was visibly round with their child, She put her face against his shoulder and breathed him in, and he held her there for a long moment. "Sutter is convicted," he said against her hair. 18 months. The two hired men took plea agreements. "Good," she said into his shoulder. "I am very glad." "I am glad to be home," he said. Home. He said it the way she had hoped he would eventually say it, not with qualification or as a placeholder. As a fact. The baby came in the first week of February 1884, which was to say exactly a year and a half after Jeremiah had first ridden into Dusty Creek on his gray horse with his grief and his quiet and his careful way of seeing. Mrs. Calhoun attended. Vera Hutchins was in the house because Vera was constitutionally incapable of being elsewhere when something important was happening, and also because she was genuinely helpful. Jeremiah was in the house because he had refused with polite but absolute firmness to be anywhere else, and Mrs. Calhoun had made her peace with this after he had demonstrated that he would not faint and would do exactly what he was asked to do and no more. The labor was long but not complicated. Sadie was, as she had promised, not fragile. She was determined and practical and intermittently aggravated, which she expressed in terms that made Vera raise her eyebrows and Mrs. Calhoun suppress a smile. Jeremiah held her hand when she needed it and gave her space when she needed that, and was quiet in the spaces between in the way that he was good at. At 3:30 in the morning, their son was born. He was red and loud and furiously alive, and when Mrs. Calhoun placed him in Sadie's arms and then looked at Jeremiah, Jeremiah was standing at the bedside with an expression on his face that was entirely undone in the best possible way, stripped of every layer of careful reserve he had built over years, just a man looking at his child with the full force of what that meant. Sadie looked up at him from the pillow. "Come here," she said softly. He sat at the edge of the bed, and she shifted so he could see the boy's face clearly, the shut eyes and the small working mouth and the remarkable red scrunch of him. "Hello," Jeremiah said quietly to the baby, with a gravity and a gentleness that made Sadie's heart compress painfully with love. The baby, who had been hollering since his arrival, went quiet. "He stopped," Vera breathed from the corner. "He knows his father's voice," Mrs. Calhoun said, in the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who had seen this happen 100 times and found it reliable. Jeremiah looked at Sadie. His eyes were bright. "What shall we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names in a general way without settling on anything specific, because they had not known, and they had each been circling around the question that neither had raised directly, which was whether to use a name of the past or to make a new one. "Thomas," Jeremiah said, which was the name she knew had been his father's. "If you are agreeable," she looked at him steadily. "Thomas is a good name," she said. "Thomas Jeremiah Townsend," he nodded slowly, and there was something releasing in his face, the last of something long held. "Thomas Jeremiah Townsend," she said to the baby in her arms. "That is who you are." Biscuit, who had been shut firmly in the front room for the duration of the proceedings on Mrs. Calhoun's instruction, had at some point in the small hours of the morning pushed the door open, because doors were no more binding on Biscuit than laps were. He appeared quietly at the bedroom doorway, looked at the scene, and then walked to the bed and put his chin on the mattress beside Sadie's hip. His tail moved very slowly. Jeremiah looked at the dog. Biscuit looked at him. "You are not supposed to be in here," Jeremiah said without any conviction. Biscuit's tail moved slightly faster. Sadie reached out her free hand and put it on Biscuit's head. "Let him stay," she said. "He has been worried." "He is a dog," Jeremiah said. "He has been worried," she said again, with the finality of a woman who has just done something considerable and has earned the right to make unreasonable statements. Biscuit stayed. Thomas grew in the way that babies grow, which is to say with a speed that seems impossible, and with a personality that emerges so rapidly and specifically that it quickly becomes impossible to remember a time before it existed. He was, at 8 months, already demonstrably opinionated, an assessment delivered by Vera Hutchins with great delight, and by Jeremiah with a quiet pride that he made no attempt to conceal. The boy was dark-haired like his father, and had his mother's directness about the eyes. And he had, from very early on, a particular relationship with Biscuit that was apparently mutual and deeply felt. Biscuit treated Thomas with a protective seriousness that was entirely different from his usual approach to the world, which was joyful and indiscriminate. With Thomas, he was deliberate. He slept outside the nursery doorway. He positioned himself between the baby and the open front door when visitors came. He was, in short, taking the job of Thomas's guardian with a gravity that suggested he understood it was a job. Sadie watched this and loved Biscuit more than she had thought possible, which was saying something. Jeremiah, meanwhile, had found in fatherhood something that replenished him in a way that nothing since Clara's death had replenished him. The guilt was not gone. He did not expect it to be gone, but it had been joined by a new thing, a reason that looked forward rather than backward, and the balance between them had shifted enough that most days the forward-looking thing was heavier. He talked to Sadie about Clara sometimes still, and she listened with the same steady warmth she had always brought to it. She had suggested in the spring of 1884 that they plant something for her in the garden behind the house, and so they had planted a rose bush on the south wall, the deep red climbing kind, and it had taken hold and begun to grow. And Sadie called it Clara's rose without self-consciousness, and Jeremiah found that this was right, that it fit, that his past and his present were not incompatible things. The years moved. This is what years do in a life that is full. They move with a particular rhythm, different from the grinding slowness of empty years, forward and interesting and layered. In the spring of 1886, Sadie had their second child, a daughter this time, born on a Tuesday in May when the yard was full of bluebonnets, and the weather was, for once, exactly right. They named her Alina for Sadie's mother and called her Nell, and she arrived in the world with Biscuit already aged and gray-muzzled and sleeping more than he once had, but present, because he was always present for the things that mattered. Nell was 3 months old when Biscuit died. He went quietly on his bed by the kitchen stove on a July morning. He simply did not wake up. Sadie found him when she came down to start the day, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment with her hand over her mouth. Jeremiah came down and found her standing there and understood immediately. He put his arm around her and she let herself cry against his chest, the real kind of crying, the kind that comes from a specific place. He was a very good dog, Jeremiah said, into her hair, and she could hear in his voice that he meant it with everything he had. They buried Biscuit in the yard near Clara's rose, because it seemed right that the two losses that had become, unexpectedly, the two hinges of their shared life should be near each other. Jeremiah built a small marker from a piece of flat limestone, and Sadie painted his name on it, and Thomas, who was 2.5, stood at the graveside with his father's hand in his and regarded the whole proceeding with the careful solemnity of a small person confronting something large for the first time. "He is in the sky," Thomas said eventually, with the certainty of a child who has been given the straightforward explanation and accepted it whole. "Yes," Sadie said, "he is. With the others." Thomas said, meaning in the way of children everyone who was gone. "Yes," Jeremiah said, "with the others." He held his son's hand and looked at the little limestone marker in the summer morning, and Sadie came and slipped her hand through his arm, and they stood like that together for a moment in the yard, the 4 of them, the living ones, in the particular quiet of a grief that is not devastating but is real and deserves its space. After a while Thomas said he was hungry, and Nell made a sound from the basket on the porch, and the day resumed itself. The school continued to grow. By 1887, Dusty Creek had grown enough that Sadie's 44 children had become 72, and the county had at last provided funding for a second teacher, a serious young woman named Ada Clark who had come from San Antonio and who immediately impressed Sadie with her knowledge and her work ethic and her patience. Having a colleague was something Sadie had not realized she had been missing until she had one, and the school settled into a new rhythm that was better for everyone, including the children, who benefited from the complementary styles of two different teachers. Jeremiah had by 1887 become Dusty Creek's constable, Hicks having retired with good health and a good pension organized largely by Mayor Greer's successor, a practical man named Farrow who respected competence. Jeremiah was good at the job. He was fair without being soft and thorough without being excessive, and the town had come to trust him in the specific, local way that small towns trust the people who keep their peace, which is a trust that is neither sentimental nor unconditional, but is deeply real. The years had been good to him, not in the sense of having been easy, because they had not always been easy. There had been hard winters and a fever that had taken Thomas for a frightening week at age 3, and the loss of 2 people they cared about in the community, and the constant, low-grade difficulty of raising children and running a school, and keeping a town's peace in a territory that was still, in 1887, genuinely wild in ways that a comfortable eastern city would not have recognized. But they had been good in the sense that mattered, which was that he had not been alone in any of it, and that Sadie Langston, who was now Sadie Townsend, was the kind of woman who made every difficulty feel navigable by virtue of her presence in it. There were evenings when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and they sat together at the kitchen table, Sadie reading or writing and Jeremiah reading or working on whatever required his attention. And the quality of that shared quiet was something he had learned to recognize as the best kind of luxury, the luxury of a peace that was not the absence of things, but the presence of something deeply good. He told her this on one of those evenings in the winter of 1887, when Thomas was 3.5 and Nell was not quite 2, and the house smelled of wood smoke and supper, and the particular domestic reality of small children. He said, "I did not think this was still possible for me." She looked up from her letter. "This," he said, gesturing at the room, the house, the life in it, "this kind of living, I had concluded it was finished." She set down her pen. "I know," she said. "I want you to know that I understand what you gave me," he said. "Not what you did for me, which is not the right way to say it. What you were when I arrived here, and what you continued to be." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had fallen in love with over the body of a dog in a West Texas morning, this man who had been broken and had slowly and imperfectly and genuinely become whole, with her and beside her and because of her and because of himself. "Jeremiah," she said. "I know it is not how I usually speak," he said. "I love how you speak," she said. "I love everything about how you speak." "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since before I knew I was capable of it, and I intend to say it more often than I have said it." She rose from her chair and came around the table and sat on the edge of it beside him, and he turned toward her and put his hands on her waist and looked up at her with that open, unguarded face that still, after years, after children and difficulty and the full ordinary weight of a shared life, could stop her breath. "You say it plenty," she said softly. "You say it every morning. You say it with the wood stacked by the door and the book you left on my pillow and the way you look at the children. You have never needed more words for it, Jeremiah. You have always said it in every possible way." He pressed his forehead against her hand where she had laid it along his jaw. "Nonetheless," he said, "I love you." "I love you," she said, "enormously and specifically and completely." In 1889, when Texas was still Texas, and the wild country north and west of Dusty Creek was still genuinely wild, they had their 3rd child, a boy they named William, small and loud and as red-haired as neither of them, which produced a great deal of delighted speculation from Vera Hutchins, who remembered that Sadie's mother had a brother with red hair and considered herself vindicated by genetics. William was born in October, in the familiar bedroom of the house on Poplar Street, which had become, over 6 years, the exact shape of their life, with Nell's drawings tacked to the kitchen wall and Thomas's boots by the front door, and Jeremiah's badge on the peg in the hallway and Sadie's book on the table by the bed, and Clara's rose on the south wall of the garden, still climbing and very red, and the small limestone marker in the garden corner where Biscuit lay. The evening after William came, when Mrs. Calhoun had gone home and the older children were asleep in their rooms, and William was sleeping in the cradle by the bed with the furious concentration of a newborn who has decided that sleep is something he will do on his own terms. Jeremiah sat beside Sadie on the bed, and she leaned against him, and they were quiet together. "3," she said. "3," he said. "I did not plan all of this," she said. "When I came to Dusty Creek, I planned the school. I planned to make something here. I did not plan the rest of it." "I know," he said. "Neither did I. It is better than what I planned," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is considerably better." She turned her face up toward his. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there when she first saw him on the bench outside the saloon, and she loved them. He had gray at his temples now, and she loved that too. He looked like a man who had lived a full life and was still living it, and that was exactly what he was. "Are you happy?" she asked, not as a challenge or a test, as a genuine question, because she valued the truth of him and always had. He did not answer immediately. He thought about it the way he thought about things that deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. "Yes," he said at last. "I am happy. I am genuinely, specifically, and thoroughly happy." She smiled at him, the full kind that she had never learned to moderate. "Good," she said. "I am very glad." He pressed a kiss to her temple, warm and deliberate, and she closed her eyes and leaned into it. In the cradle, William stirred and made a small sound, and Jeremiah reached over and rested his hand on the edge of the cradle, and it rocked slightly, and the baby settled again. Outside the house, Dusty Creek went on in the dark. The sounds of the saloon 3 streets over, and the wind that still came down from the panhandle. And somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. The friendly kind of bark. The kind that meant nothing was wrong, only that the night was alive with things worth noticing. Jeremiah sat in the warm room beside his wife and listened to the sounds of his house, the breathing of his children, and the particular still music of a life that was exactly right. He had come to Dusty Creek with nothing but grief and a gray horse, and a rifle he hoped to use as little as possible. He had not been looking for anything. He had been, in some quiet and unexamined way, finished. And then a dog with amber fur and no concept of personal boundaries had climbed into his lap without permission, and a woman with ink on her cuffs and eyes that looked at everything straight on had smiled at him with her whole face, and the finished thing had turned out to be very far from finished. It had turned out to be, in fact, just beginning. Thomas was in school now, learning to read from the same shelf of readers his mother had brought from Austin years before, sitting in the same desks she had arranged herself on that first morning in 1881. He was a serious, curious boy with his father's precision and his mother's warmth, and he was already at 5, showing the particular combination of qualities that suggested he would spend his life trying to understand things, which was, as far as Sadie was concerned, the best possible outcome. Nell was learning letters with fierce determination, seated at the kitchen table each evening with a chalk and a small board, Jeremiah beside her checking her work with the patient gravity he brought to everything. He was a good teacher, which surprised neither of them given how good he was at explaining, and how naturally he took the level of the other person, rather than requiring them to rise to his. William was 3 months old and entirely focused on the business of existing, which he conducted with vigor. And Biscuit's rose climbed the south wall and turned the autumn red, and the limestone marker held his name in Sadie's careful painted letters, and the house on Poplar Street was full and warm and permanent in the way that only the best things are permanent, not unchanging but continuing, building forward from itself into something more complex and more beautiful than it had been before. The town grew around them. Dusty Creek acquired a telegraph office in 1888 and a second saloon in 1889 that Vera Hutchins disapproved of, and that Jeremiah managed with quiet authority. New families came and settled and sent their children to the school. The railroad was building closer. which would change things in ways no one could entirely predict but which seemed, on the whole, more promising than threatening. Jeremiah wrote to his sister in Missouri more regularly now, and she had come to visit in the summer of 1888. A warm and curious woman named Ruth who had regarded Sadie with the particular relief of a person who had been worried about someone for a long time and could now let that worry go. Ruth and Sadie had liked each other immediately and completely, and the visit had extended an extra week beyond its planned duration because no one was in a hurry to end it. Sadie wrote to her mother in Austin every week, long letters full of the specific texture of their life. Her mother came when she could, and the house was good at holding people, good at making space, the way houses are when they have been built with care and filled with love. In the evenings of those years, after the children were in bed and the lamps were low, Jeremiah and Sadie sat together in the front room with its full bookshelves and its view of the garden. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were quiet, and sometimes he read aloud to her, because he had discovered that she liked to listen while her hands were busy with something. And he had discovered that he liked the sound of her laugh when she found something in a book funny. And it turned out this was a thing he could produce reliably by choosing the right passages. And sometimes she put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the quiet of the house and the town and the wide West Texas night. And it was the simplest and most complete thing that either of them had ever known. He had not smiled at anything or anyone when he came to Dusty Creek. He had been past smiling. He had been a man whose interior weather had settled into a permanent gray, functional and survivable, but devoid of light. And then an amber-colored dog with no concept of permission had climbed into his lap and looked at him with the absolute certainty that this was correct. And a woman with ink on her cuffs had stood in the morning sun and said, "I am Sadie Langston," and looked at him without flinching, and the gray had begun, slowly and then all at once, to clear. It had not been a single moment. It had been 1,000 small ones. The lantern light at the supper, the hand on his on the corner of Biscuit's back, the vows in the little church, the weight of Thomas in his arms on the first night of his son's life, the letter from his sister that said, "I am glad for you," the rose on the south wall, the chalk drawings on the kitchen plaster, the quiet evenings and the difficult ones and the mornings that were unremarkable in every way except that she was in them. But if there was a beginning, he knew exactly where it was. It was a bench on Main Street on an October morning in 1882, and a dog who climbed into his lap without permission, and the smile of a woman who understood, somehow already, that the dog was doing the right thing. He had not smiled at anything or anyone until Biscuit had climbed into his lap, and Sadie Langston had stood in the morning sun and looked at him, and the thing that had been finished had opened itself back up and begun to grow. And everything that grew from it was good. William learned to walk in the spring, on steady, determined legs that he had clearly been planning to use for some time. He walked to his father first, which Thomas regarded as a matter of deep personal pride, as if he had coached him, and which made Jeremiah kneel on the kitchen floor and catch his youngest son with both hands and look at him with an expression that was so simple and so whole that Sadie, watching from the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, felt the tears come before she thought about them. "Look at you," Jeremiah said to William in his low, careful voice, holding the boy steady. "Look at you." William, who at 9 months had not yet developed the means to fully respond to this, put his hand on Jeremiah's face with the directness of a child who knows exactly where the things he wants are. "He has your eyes," Sadie said from the doorway. Jeremiah looked up at her. The afternoon light was through the kitchen window behind her, and she was standing in it, slightly smiling, and she had her hair coming loose again the way it always did by afternoon, dark and loose at her temple. And she was exactly herself, exactly the person she had been on that October morning, and also everything more that she had become. And he loved her with a completeness that still, after years, arrived in him with the quality of surprise. "Come here," he said. She crossed the kitchen and crouched down beside them on the floor, and William, delighted to have his parents at eye level, grabbed both their faces at once with his small, capable hands. And Thomas appeared from the other room and said, "What are we doing?" And Nell followed Thomas because Nell followed Thomas everywhere. And suddenly the kitchen floor was occupied by all five of them, and William was laughing the particular brilliant laugh of a baby who does not know yet that anything is difficult. And Sadie looked at Jeremiah over the top of William's head, and the thing in his face was the thing that had been there since that first full smile in the lantern light, but deeper now, settled. Permanent. He was here. He was fully here. The man who had ridden into Dusty Creek in the autumn of 1882 on a gray horse with his grief folded into him like a letter he had read so many times he had the words memorized, was sitting on his kitchen floor in the autumn of 1889, surrounded by his children and holding his wife's gaze, and he was, unmistakably and without reservation, home. Dusty Creek held them. The school held their children and the children of the town, and the children of families who had come from far away to build something in the red Texas earth. The little house on Poplar Street held their life, all the years of it, accumulating in the way that good lives accumulate, with warmth and with continuity, and with the presence of people who had chosen each other and kept on choosing. And in the garden on the south wall, the rose that was Clara's climbed every spring and turned deep red every fall, and Biscuit's name stayed clear on the limestone, and the garden grew around them both, tended by Sadie's hands and watered by the Texas rain, and it was, in its way, a complete thing. A beginning and a middle and a good end, all of it growing from a single morning when a dog had decided, with the infallible certainty of animals who understand things that people have forgotten how to understand, that the man on the bench needed exactly this, and had climbed into his lap without asking, and had been right.